In April 1912, the RMS Titanic set sail on her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York, hailed as the most advanced and luxurious ship ever built. Engineers believed her design made her practically unsinkable. On the night of April 14th, everything changed. Sailing through the icy waters of the North Atlantic, the ship struck an iceberg. Within hours, the massive vessel began to sink. Lifeboats were limited, distress signals were delayed, and confusion spread across the decks. By early morning, the Titanic had disappeared beneath the ocean, taking more than 1,500 people with her. The disaster exposed fatal flaws in maritime safety standards and led to major international reforms, including stricter lifeboat requirements and continuous radio monitoring. More than a century later, the Titanic remains a symbol of ambition, overconfidence, and the tragic cost of human error. In the mid-14th century, a deadly disease began spreading across Europe with terrifying speed. Known as the Black Death, the plague arrived in 1347, likely carried by fleas on rats traveling along trade routes from Asia. Within months, entire cities were overwhelmed. Victims developed painful swellings, fever, and darkened skin before dying within days. Fear spread faster than the illness itself. Families abandoned loved ones, mass graves filled quickly, and social order began to collapse. Between 1347 and 1351, an estimated 25 to 50 million people died in Europe alone, roughly one-third of the population. The devastation reshaped economies, weakened feudal systems, and changed religious and social structures forever. Labor shortages gave surviving workers more bargaining power, altering class dynamics across the continent. The Black Death remains one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, permanently transforming medieval society. On the morning of December 26, 2004, a massive undersea earthquake struck off the coast of Sumatra, Indonesia. Measuring around 9.1 in magnitude, it was one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded. The violent shift of the ocean floor triggered a series of enormous tsunami waves that raced across the Indian Ocean at jet speed. Coastal communities in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, Thailand, and several other countries had little to no warning. Within minutes, walls of water crashed ashore, sweeping away homes, roads, and entire villages. More than 230,000 people lost their lives across 14 countries. Millions were displaced. The scale of destruction shocked the world and exposed the lack of early warning systems in the region. In response, new international tsunami monitoring networks were established. The disaster remains one of the deadliest natural catastrophes in modern history. In the early hours of April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded during a late-night safety test. Located near the city of Pripyat in northern Ukraine, the blast released massive amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere. Firefighters arrived within minutes, unaware of the invisible danger surrounding them. Many received fatal doses of radiation while trying to contain the flames. Entire neighborhoods were evacuated, but only after exposure had already begun. A 19-mile exclusion zone was established, forcing more than 100,000 people to leave their homes. In the years that followed, increased cancer rates and environmental contamination were linked to the disaster. Chernobyl exposed deep flaws in Soviet nuclear safety and secrecy, reshaped global energy policies, and remains a powerful warning about the risks of nuclear power. On September 11, 2001, a clear Tuesday morning in the United States turned into one of the most devastating days in modern history. 19 hijackers affiliated with Al-Qaeda seized 4 commercial airplanes. 2 were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. A third struck the Pentagon, and a fourth crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers resisted. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. Within hours, the towers collapsed, sending shockwaves across the world. The attacks led to the US-led War on Terror, military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, and sweeping changes in global security laws. Airport screenings tightened, surveillance expanded, and foreign policy shifted dramatically. More than 2 decades later, the impact of 9/11 continues to shape international politics and global security systems. On the night of December 2nd, 1984, a silent cloud of deadly gas began leaking from a pesticide plant operated by Union Carbide in Bhopal. Methyl isocyanate, a highly toxic chemical, spread rapidly through nearby neighborhoods while most residents were asleep. Within minutes, people woke up coughing, choking, and unable to breathe. Panic filled the streets as thousands tried to flee the invisible poison. By morning, bodies lay across roads and homes. Official estimates say over 3,000 people died immediately, but long-term deaths are believed to exceed 15,000. Hundreds of thousands suffered permanent injuries. Investigations later revealed serious safety failures and poor maintenance. The disaster led to global reforms in industrial safety laws, but for many survivors, the effects of that night continue across generations. Under the regime of Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany carried out the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, including Roma, disabled individuals, political opponents, and prisoners of war. What began with discrimination and segregation escalated into ghettos, mass shootings, and ultimately extermination camps such as Auschwitz concentration camp. Victims were transported in overcrowded trains, stripped of identity, and killed in gas chambers designed for efficiency. The scale and organization of the genocide were unprecedented. When Allied forces liberated the camps in 1945, the world confronted the full horror. The Holocaust reshaped international law, led to the creation of the United Nations Genocide Convention, and remains one of history's darkest reminders of how hatred, when institutionalized, can lead to unimaginable destruction. In 1915, during the turmoil of World War I, the Ottoman Empire began the mass deportation and killing of its Armenian population. What authorities described as relocation for security quickly turned into death marches across the Syrian desert. Men were often executed first. Women, children, and the elderly were forced to walk for weeks without food or water. Entire villages disappeared. Historians estimate that around 1 to 1.5 million Armenians died between 1915 and 1917. Survivors were scattered across the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas, forming a global diaspora. The events remain deeply controversial in international politics, with debates over recognition continuing to this day. The Armenian genocide stands as one of the first large-scale genocides of the 20th century, and a warning about how nationalism and war can turn against a nation's own citizens. In 1932 and 1933, a devastating famine swept across Soviet Ukraine under the rule of Joseph Stalin. Unlike natural famines caused by drought or crop failure, this crisis was largely the result of forced collectivization policies and unrealistic grain quotas imposed by the Soviet government. Farmers were required to surrender much of their harvest to the state, leaving rural families with little to survive on. Borders were sealed, food was confiscated, and those who resisted faced punishment. Villages emptied as starvation took hold. Scholars estimate that between 3 and 5 million Ukrainians died within a single year. For decades, the tragedy was denied or minimized by Soviet authorities. Today, many countries recognize the Holodomor as a deliberate act of repression, and it remains a deeply painful chapter in Ukraine's national memory. On April 7, 1994, violence erupted in Rwanda following the assassination of President Juvenal Habyarimana. What followed was one of the fastest genocides in modern history. Extremist leaders encouraged members of the Hutu majority to target the Tutsi minority and moderate Hutus. Militias set up roadblocks, went door to door, and carried out mass killings with shocking speed. In just about 100 days, an estimated 800,000 people were murdered. The international community was widely criticized for failing to intervene despite clear warning signs. When the violence finally ended in July 1994, the country was left devastated. Families were torn apart, infrastructure collapsed, and trust between communities was shattered. The genocide reshaped Rwanda's future and remains a powerful reminder of how propaganda, fear, and political manipulation can escalate into unimaginable violence. Beginning in the 15th century and lasting for over 400 years, the Atlantic slave trade forcibly transported millions of Africans across the ocean to the Americas. European traders worked with local intermediaries to capture and sell men, women, and children into slavery. Packed tightly onto ships in brutal conditions, many did not survive the journey known as the Middle Passage. Historians estimate that more than 12 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic, with millions more dying before reaching the coast. Enslaved people were forced into labor on plantations, in mines, and in households, fueling the economic growth of European empires and American colonies. The system was built on violence, dehumanization, and racial ideology. Its consequences shaped societies on multiple continents and left lasting social, economic, and cultural scars that are still felt today. In August 1945, near the end of World War II, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6th, the bomb Little Boy exploded over Hiroshima, instantly killing tens of thousands. 3 days later, Fat Man detonated above Nagasaki. The blasts leveled cities, ignited firestorms, and exposed survivors to deadly radiation. By the end of 1945, an estimated 200,000 people had died from the explosions and related illnesses. Japan surrendered shortly after, bringing World War II to a close. The bombings marked the first and only use of nuclear weapons in war. They reshaped global politics, sparked the Cold War arms race, and forced humanity to confront the destructive power of atomic technology. The world had entered a new and dangerous era. In August 1947, as British rule ended, the Indian subcontinent was divided into 2 new nations, India and Pakistan. The decision was made quickly, drawing borders along religious lines between Hindu majority and Muslim majority regions. What followed was one of the largest migrations in human history. Around 14 to 15 million people crossed the newly formed borders in search of safety. Trains arrived filled with refugees, and sometimes with bodies. Communal violence erupted across Punjab and Bengal. Entire villages were attacked, and families were forced to flee with little more than what they could carry. Historians estimate that up to 1 million people were killed. The partition reshaped South Asia's political landscape and left deep scars that continue to influence relations between the 2 nations today. In 1845, a potato blight struck Ireland, destroying the crop that much of the population depended on for survival. At the time, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, and while food continued to be exported from the country, millions of poor Irish families had little access to relief. The failure of successive harvests led to widespread starvation and disease. Over the next 7 years, around 1 million people died from hunger and illness, including typhus and cholera. Another million emigrated, many boarding overcrowded ships to North America in desperate conditions. Entire communities were emptied, and Ireland's population dropped dramatically. The famine transformed Irish society, intensified resentment toward British rule, and reshaped migration patterns across the world. Its memory remains central to Irish identity and national history. For centuries, the Library of Alexandria stood as one of the most important centers of learning in the ancient world. Founded in the Egyptian city of Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy, the first Soter, in the 3rd century BCE, it aimed to collect all human knowledge. Scholars from across Greece, Egypt, Persia, and beyond studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy within its walls. It is believed that hundreds of thousands of scrolls were stored there. That library's destruction did not happen in a single moment, but likely through a series of fires, wars, and political upheavals over centuries. By late antiquity, it had vanished. The loss meant countless works of science and literature disappeared forever. Today, the Library of Alexandria symbolizes both the heights of human curiosity and the fragile nature of knowledge itself.